Hello, everyone. My name is Joshua Gilliland, and I am one of the founding attorneys of the Legal Geeks. With me to discuss the Mandalorian episode Guns for Hire is Gregory Pang and Nari Ely. For disclaimer purposes, nothing we say represents our employers. This is for entertainment. This is for fun. This is how lawyers, after stressful days at work, unwind. We talk about our favorite shows. Greg, it's been a while. How are you doing?
I'm doing awesome, Josh. Just my team. We're in New Jersey. I know the listeners can't see this, but we're in my Jersey. There's in the playoffs, fighting for the division and conference crown, and we're doing pretty well over here. Thanks for having me on here. It's an honor.
It's always nice to catch up with our Canadian office. Nari, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm always happy to be here, Josh. Thanks for having me. I did want to also give the other disclaimer that we usually give, which is that nothing on this show should be construed as legal advice. If you have a ownership dispute over a dark lightsaber, you should probably retain your own attorney.
And we'll also throw out owning people is bad. We don't do that. No.
That's a brave stance. Brave stance, Josh.
No, bad. So this episode is full of cameos from Jack Black to Christopher Lloyd to oh no, Lizzo.
Yes,
you can see she was great on Saturday Night Live. I am not good at current music, so I'm a child of the 80s. I'm very good with play that tune there, not here. So she was adorable and apparently is a huge Grogu fan. So she got to have a rip-roaring good time. And
she did great.
Mm-hmm. It was adorable. So this planet or this city-state is a direct democracy. And that made my political theory head spin and flashing back to Davis and all the classes I took as an undergrad, because that is radically complicated for a bunch of people to show up on a hill and go like, so what are we going to do? And they vote. We don't do that. Now, Greg, you have some theories on this direct democracy. Can you talk us through this? And we'll probably jump into a little comparative law between Parliament and Congress. Take it away.
Yeah, my pleasure, Josh. So not so much theories, but just a little explanation, because there was that one line that was mentioned. We're the last direct democracy in the Outer Rim, I believe it was. And so direct democracy, so two major types of democracy now. You can really go down a rabbit hole on these kinds of things about types of democracies. There can be subtypes, but two major types are direct democracy and representative democracy. Direct democracy is where the citizens have a direct say, a direct vote, whether through referenda or whatever kind of mechanism, to have a direct say into what happens to the governance and lawmaking in the country or whatever jurisdiction that is subject to that direct democracy. Whereas representative democracy is more of what we are used to, both the United States and Canada, where we elect representatives to a level government and they represent us in a legislature, a parliament, or Congress, or whatever, or something like that. So here they are a direct democracy, but it's kind of interesting, though, is that I think the plan's called Plaisir. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, Plaisir 15, that Captain Bombardier and the Duchess are, it was mentioned that they are elected regal, some kind of elected regal heads of state. So maybe like Naboo in a way, where, like they elect their queen. So perhaps there's some kind of constitutional monarchy or direct democracy monarchy or something like that, where their heads of state have some kind of royal status, but they are elected officials to represent the planet or the government.
I thought the line was they were royalty and elected, so they could, and so instead of like England having a prime minister that gets elected and serves at the pleasure of the king or queen, whoever's in, the monarchy, that they overlap. So their Venn diagram is a circle. And so that was,
Yeah, I think that's how I interpret it as well, that they had been the previous monarchs, are still technically in the royal family, whether or not that royal family now has all the political power, but now have been elected to be the chief executives on this planet. And so I think, Josh, that's how I interpreted it, that yes, it's now an overlapping circle of a Venn diagram. I also wanted to note, so Greggy, that was a really great explanation of the differences between representative and direct democracy. I interpret what's happening on this planet to be, well, I should actually start by saying my first thought, which is that most governments that we think of as democratic have some elements of both. For example, in the United States, while for the most part we elect representatives who then pass laws, most states have some form, or at least many states have some form of direct democracy by petition and things like that, where the citizens can actually directly pass laws with some limitations and caveats. So I kind of interpret what's going on this planet as something similar, where they are much more on the side of direct democracy and don't appear to have any legislative body. And instead, the people are directly proposing and voting on and passing legislation, but that they seem to still have an executive who they elect. So I would interpret it as like most democracies, a mixture, but far more on the scale, the spectrum of direct democracy than anything that we have today or in our real world. I also do want to point out, as you mentioned, that they said they're the last direct democracy in the Outer Rim. Usually it becomes increasingly difficult to manage just as like an administrative logistical matter. Direct democracy is the larger and more complex your society gets. So because this kind of appears to be the equivalent of a city state, perhaps they can still manage it, although they still seem to have an executive with executive like administrative functions. But I would imagine that is why it becomes vanishingly rare to have a direct democracy the larger worlds get.
yeah, I think it would be super messy.
Even in this episode, they point out a couple times, at least once, where the direct democracy has gone awry. And that's in that they have, through their direct democracy, the citizens passed a law that you cannot shut down all of the droids, apparently with no exceptions. So that was a funny one.
Yeah, it is bonkers to think about, which gets to the other issue that everyone just wants to do arts, leisure, and participate in the direct democracy. And they rely exclusively on all the droids to do all of the work. That is, I think, terrifying. And it raises, the complex issue that we've seen in Star Wars with droids with, are they sentient slaves? And seeing a droid bar where they're hanging out, partaking in like a oil infusion that has programming in it, that is super problematic. Especially they're willing to be subservient and do work because they don't want to get shut down. They don't want to just be eliminated and replaced by biological workers. So they're willing to do all the menial labor, but they also feel that they're contributing by doing that. It is profoundly weird,
disturbing.
Yeah, it's like, well, that those shouldn't be your only options. Like if you have free will and desires, then you should be able to live as you want and do what you want. And we shouldn't have a class of individuals that just hangs out and paints.
Yeah, this is something that Star Wars has flirted with. This topic. I'm trying to remember the specific name of the droid in Solo, for example, and her fight for droid rights.
L3.
Thank you, L3. It's a topic that Star Wars has only ever flirted with, as opposed to sort of tackling head on. But we do have the suggestion over the course of many different Star Wars media that droids are in fact what we think of as people, for all intents and purposes. Even in this show, I think the audience is probably with me that we think that I'm trying to remember his name, the assassin droid. Oh, what's his name?
IG-11 or IG-88?
Thank you, IG-11. Yes, probably was a person, and we were very sad when he perished. And so, not to mention all the other droids from all the other series, it's a topic that Star Wars has suggested, that these droids are sentient, are self-aware, and maybe people for all intents and purposes, but has not actually taken on this issue of droid rights in the Star Wars universe. And maybe we're in for that at some point, but it seems like not today.
Yeah, Greg, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's really super interesting because I think like an analog in our real world is that, okay, look at the kind of jobs that we do nowadays. A lot of work, policy work, like policy analyst and office worker work. And then you look at what we're doing now, and then look at what we used to do before. We had a lot of automation and machinery doing work and stuff like that. If you were to ask someone, let's say 100, 200 years ago, like, what do you think of the work that we do now? It's like, that's not work. You're not out in the field. You're not doing things with your hands, right? So like it was kind of funny. The I don't remember the exact line, but like I see, like from what we saw in the episode, is that these droids were doing a lot of the service level work and manual labor work, right? But then there's also like a lot of stuff that we do that we see every day. A lot of the civilian members of where I work is that they work at desks and they do policy and they do analyst work and stuff like that. So we haven't seen quite droids do that, like at least on this planet, on this city state or whatever it is. So it might be one of those things that there are a lot of people still doing work, but it's none of the manual labor, and none of them know how to do any of that anymore.
Yeah, and it's a difference between you sending a droid out to go get giant buckets full of hot lava on Mustafar that would, incinerate a biological life form, or in the vacuum of space where a biological life form would die horrifically, or say undersea operations, as opposed to flipping burgers. Like, it's a really weird dynamic of, does everyone just have like bare minimum income that they all get? And so is this like Andrew Yang land where everyone's just getting like, it's kind of it's not really communism, it's something else, where they're getting their income that they need to survive, and their job is participating in direct democracy. It's a very weird thing to think about, because that's not us. Like, it's just, we're used to coming together in a town, or I think it's Claremont College has the motto that the city exists for commerce, or something along those lines, that, which is I think it's a Aristotelian or Platonic reference. What's the purpose then? Like, is everyone just, it's like, at what point does it turn into Caligula, that they're just there having succulence from a living creature with tubes that they're all enjoying? It's a really weird place.
Well, and before we get too far off the topic, I did want to mention there's actually one group of people on this planet, of biological people, who does not appear to be solely engaged in pursuit of the arts and participation in democracy and pondering philosophy, which is the Ugnaughts. And it's never really explained. I was watching the episode, I was a little worried at first that this was like the underclass that lived under the city. But everything we see in the episode suggests that they're there voluntarily, but that's what they want to be doing. And I think, that is an interesting possibility, that they're living in a world in which, however they're achieving it through some kind of social safety net or what have you, that people could live lives of leisure and pursuit of the arts. But because of what Ugnaughts want to do with their lives, they would rather be doing mechanic work.
Yeah.
Maybe it's kind of like the Star Trek universe, like in the Federation, that it's kind of the same thing. It's like, oh, we're advanced so far that all the stuff that we don't want to do is taken care of, by, in this case, droids, and then we can pursue whatever we really want to do to advance society and self-fulfillment and et cetera, et cetera. So it's interesting without having more, but we don't have more information on how the actual economics of this world works.
That and it boomerangs quickly back into you're exploiting a class of people so you can live a life of luxury while they're doing all the grunt work for you. Like, it's a very weird thing. I mean, it's like there are jobs that have gone away that aren't coming back. Like, we're not going to bring back the whaling industry to New England. That's done. We're not doing that again. There's coal mining's changed because of automation and also moving towards fuels that do not require digging up coal or moving away from petroleum. Those are like economic changes. And with that, those jobs go away and they're replaced by another type of job. So, I mean, I get the person who goes, my great grandpa hunted whales and I want to do that too, but you got to let that go. And that doesn't mean learn coding, but it doesn't mean go to a coal mine either. It means you're going to learn something else.
At the risk of going down a very deep rabbit hole, so I will try to not do that and keep this short. It is worth noting that, with I'm sure people have heard, at least in passing, about the recent advances in AI and machine learning and things like that, that are treading into territory that we have traditionally thought of as not the jobs that machines would take over, like making, like writing articles, writing stories or poems, making visual art, like exactly the kind of things that I think the people on this planet are still employed in. And it's interesting to think about that, those kinds of things may not necessarily be solely the purview of biological humans, even in our reality in the foreseeable future. However, I think like there's something to be said for the idea that, as I think you've noted, Josh, every significant advancement in technology has brought scary disruptive change, but there will usually be things for humans to do. There will usually be a market for art that we consider to be authentic in some way because it's made by a thinking, feeling person on the other end of it. And so I think at the end of the day, there's likely to still be things for the people of this planet to do. I agree with Greg's point, though, that the economics of this are not really as well explained, because in the Star Trek universe, with the advent of replicators and everything, it's explained why sort of typical economic scarcity for most things isn't really an issue anymore. It's never been the case in the Star Wars universe, and there's been plenty of scarcity, of people scrabbling to get by. And so it is a little bit odd. I'm going to have to assume that they're sitting on some massive natural resource that we don't know about, that they're selling off slowly and can keep funding their society.
Yeah, or something renewable that they have now. It's like they have the Hyperloop to get around the city. So we haven't built one of those. So there's that. And again, for changes in society, we don't have gaslighters anymore. Like, they're not walking out at dusk to light the lamps on the streets. So again, that job's gone.
Well, I thought you meant the other type of gaslighter, but not those people. But
it's again, that's not a career.
Yeah, we have plenty of those other gaslighters.
That's a bad lifestyle choice, and it's hurtful. And don't go around hurting people. But that brings us to our Mandalorian friends, and there's the issue of the free exercise clause and the creed. And Nari, was that you who added
yeah
that?
So I went nuts when we got to this part, and it's like a single line in the show, but just as a law nerd, it made me so happy that this direct democracy had passed a couple potentially conflicting laws. The first one was that they were effectively a pacifist society, and by law forbid their own defense forces and their own law enforcement from carrying weapons within the city. Now, of course, you would need weapons to deal with hostile droids. So fortunately, it is mentioned that their direct democracy had also passed a law that allowed the free exercise of religion. And for Mandalorians, and this was like almost just like a pithy one-liner from like season 1, where Mando says, "Guns are my religion." But as it turns out, there is a non-frivolous point of view from the Mandalorians and the Creed that carrying at least one weapon is in fact part of their religion, and so they decide that in this conflict they are allowed to carry weapons, even though they have this law notwithstanding it. Now, this is great because it actually brings up some real world concepts that we have in the United States, and that is, of course, the free exercise clause of the First Amendment, that people will have the right to exercise their religious beliefs. Now, this is in addition to the Establishment Clause, which is that the government will not establish religion, and they mean different things. So the Establishment Clause is what we normally think of when we're thinking about like preferencing one religion over another, or making official sort of religious invocations part of school prayer, or at the start of legislature sessions, things like that, that have this sort of imprimatur of the government official. But in the free exercise, this is just me wanting to do something that I believe is mandated by my religious beliefs and potentially coming into conflict with a law. I'll give the tiny little primer of free exercise jurisprudence and law in the United States, which is that for a while, the free exercise clause was pretty limited in its scope under Supreme Court jurisprudence. Specifically, I think it was Smith versus Employment Division, in which the Supreme Court held that if a neutral law of general applicability, you could not get a religious exception as a result of having a neutral law of general applicability enforced against you. So this would be, for example, assume that there is no evidence of religious animus. A legislature passes a law that says that people must work Monday through Friday. Of course, some religions have holy days in Monday through Friday. Some religions, specifically, I think Friday. Someone might say, this violates my religious beliefs. I think that I should be able to take Friday off, and it should not be part of the law. That would run into problems with Employment Division v. Smith, because it is a neutral law. It's generally applicable. Why does this person get an exception? So which was pretty limited in scope, as you can imagine. The free exercise clause would generally seem to not have a lot of teeth under that interpretation. And so what happened after that is that Congress passed what was known as the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which essentially changed the standard to be that people had a right to exercise their religious beliefs, and the government could not impose a substantial burden on the exercise of those beliefs. And if they did so, they would have to essentially pass strict scrutiny, what we call in constitutional law. So the government would have to show that it was the narrowest possible way to achieve a compelling government interest was by enforcing this law, even against this religious person, and not giving an exception. Long story short, it was held as unconstitutional against the states, but it still applies at the federal level. And I believe most states have passed a state version of it. So if you live in most states in the United States, this is the standard of free exercise that you live under, which is essentially putting strict scrutiny in there and adding this substantial burden standard instead of if it's a generally applicable neutral law of general applicability. So there is a real world example that I think is analogous to Mando here, which is that Sikhs, as a major tenet of their faith, I believe it's like the 5 principal tenets, are supposed to carry essentially like a symbolic weapon. It is called a kirpan. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm not Sikh myself. On them at all times. It's usually about 2.5 inches. But a lot of Sikhs consider it to be purely symbolic and doesn't need to be sharp, but it's a knife. It's essentially a dagger. And at least as far as I was able to tell in my research, while Sikhs have been fighting for a long time to have exceptions to allow them to carry it into public schools, into airports, onto planes, for the most part, the government has not allowed them to do so, and the courts have not ruled in their favor. which is a bit unfortunate. So in our reality, I think unfortunately Mando would not be able to carry weapons. I will note that this is talking about knives, not talking about guns, blasters, or other or dark sabers. But there is a real world analogy, and unfortunately, I don't think it would work in Mando's favor.
Agreed that the Second Amendment doesn't turn into the First, so no. Now, Greg, I've joked about the Monty Python bit about mysterious women in lakes handing out swords as no basis for a government. But that's kind of what we have going on in with the Mandalorians. Can you talk us through their system of government and whether or not they have a unwritten constitution on how they do business?
Sure thing. But before I get into that, just a comment about Sikhs and Kirpans. In here, I think just a few years ago, maybe less than 10 years ago, and I can't talk with any confidence about the particulars of the ruling, but I think it was challenged under our Charter of Rights and Freedom, Section 2, and it was either allowed in schools or some kind of setting where you can have a Kirpan, but then there are conditions attached. It has to be sheathed and a few other things. But so we have a decision, but again, I can't speak to any specifics
no, Greg,
about
I think
it here.
You're correct. I remember reading it's Canada and the UK. So
Yes.
Yeah. So of common law jurisdictions, the US may actually be the outlier here.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I just want to add that. So, but that was a really cool analysis, Nari. Darksaber. This is in regard to the Darksaber succession rules, I guess you could say. And I had surmised that, okay, so what's all going on here? They seem to be a sophisticated, Mandalorians are sophisticated, technologically advanced, spacefaring society, right? So, but they seem to have this thing where it's like, we're just doing this on custom, and do people really know the law and stuff like that? But we have to remember that their society has been devastated. I mean, the Empire committed genocide on them, and maybe they don't have their constitutional scholars. So my thing is here that I think that they have, how they operate is some kind of unwritten constitution. It's not just that they can't find what's written down and how to interpret this thing. So, let's just go through what has been said on screen here, is that the Darksaber must be one in combat, quote unquote, one in combat. And I'll quote the armorer: whoever wields it can rule all of Mandalore. It is said one warrior will defeat 20 and multitudes will fall before it. If, however, it is not one in combat and falls into the hands of the undeserving, it will be a curse unto the nation. Mandalore will be laid to waste and its people scattered to the four winds. Okay, so that's what the armorer said. And now we go to Moff Gideon. He said something very similar. In, I think, the very last episode of season 2, it must be won in battle. In order for her to wield the Darksaber again, she would need to defeat you in combat. And then Din goes, I yield, it's yours. And then Moff Gideon continues, oh no, it doesn't work that way. The Darksaber doesn't have power. The story does. Without the blade, she's a pretender to the throne. So there's a bit of what some people have been calling a technicality. It's that, like that Din lost to that weird cyborg machine. He was dispossessed of the Darksaber. So he was bested in combat by that thing. And then I was about to call her Starbuck, but no, Bo-Katan won it beat the weird cyborg thing in combat, and then so she beat the last person who had possessed it. Arguably, did he possess it or did he cast it away? But anyways, he possessed the Darksaber, so she is the rightful owner of it here. And it's like, so what's going on here is that, okay, so my headcanon is that, okay, this was first customary. That's like whoever holds the Darksaber, whoever wins it in combat, is going to rule all of Mandalore. And then became some kind of constitutional norm. And then it became some kind of a part of an unwritten constitution for Mandalore. And there is precedent for this in our real world, is that the UK has partly an unwritten constitution. And there are other, arguably other constitutional scholars in the United States as well. I read that they argue that there are unwritten parts of our constitution that are still part of our constitution, even though they're not codified in the written constitution. So there is precedent for this, and we could make room for, yes, this could be some kind of law in Mandalore that is supported by Axe Wolf's interpretation when Din explained that, yes, this is how she won it in combat. So it's not a technicality. This is the Constitution, man. So, will the armorer and the rest of the children of the Watch agree with this interpretation? I guess we'll see. I haven't seen the next episode yet. So it's my thing. Another thing, and just going down a little bit of a rabbit hole myself, is that, okay, so they reformed their society. Bo-Katan has Darksaber. One thing they could do to confirm this, instead of being Axe Wolf's interpretation, and is that once they reestablished their judicial system, is that they could refer the question for interpretation by their courts. And I don't know if I don't know what the equivalent of you call it there, but we call it reference cases to our Supreme Court. So it's like, please interpret this question of law or constitution, of constitutionality for us. So I imagine that now that would be make the worst season of or worst episode of Mandalorian ever, but that can go to whatever supreme equivalent of Supreme Court that they have, or Court of Appeal, whatever, to interpret that constitutional question and confirm that this is constitutional, that Bo-Katan was the rightful possessor, owner of the Darksaber, and therefore the rightful ruler of all of Mandalore.
So a couple points there. First off, it'd be the greatest episode because they could bring us in and we could participate and we would bring sexy back. We would absolutely rock that. From what you just described, that's something our courts won't do because it sounds like an advisory opinion, and our courts don't do that. Now, the Attorney General can do an advisory opinion. State attorney generals do that all the time, and so does, because they'll give guidance on, we think this is how it's going to be interpreted, but we'd actually need a dispute for it to go before a court. So there has to be a case in controversy. So
yeah,
again,
it's just for the legal geeks out there, this would be Article 3, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution, which limits the jurisdiction of the federal courts, including the Supreme Court, to cases and controversies. So that has been interpreted to mean that the court cannot issue an advisory opinion when there is not a dispute between adversarial parties to present that question, essentially.
And that's really interesting. Yeah, because for us, we have. Our governments have sent for essentially those exact same things. Maybe because we're a socialist country or something like that. Maybe we're just more. You don't have to be fighting. We can actually just ask the court, can you rule on this question of law? And one of the ones that I remember reading in law school way long ago was about the succession of Quebec. The Quebec sovereignty question, a question of international law. Can you rule on this? And then they issued a written decision, and then something called the Clarity Act was passed about the clarification of a question of succession or separation or whatnot. So that's really interesting. That's really cool to hear.
Yeah, you could go all the way back to Marbury v. Madison, where you had the outgoing Adams administration try delivering some judicial appointments, but they didn't go out on time. This is the abridged version. And so the new Jefferson administration was like, well, let's just take it to the Supreme Court. And it's like, no, we don't have original jurisdiction for that. So you got to work your way up to the Supreme Court for judicial review. So it's like our systems are different. And this just turned into a fun comparative law discussion. Oh, Nari, your hands.
I was just going to say, I just checked, and so of course, because this is the federal constitution that limits the courts from giving advisory opinions, you'd have to check your state constitution to find out if your state Supreme Court or courts can't issue advisory opinions. And some states, apparently specifically, for example, Rhode Island, do have procedures by which other parts of the government can certify questions and get advisory opinions from their state Supreme Court. So you should check your local constitution.
The more you know. So
I just like to correct something I said. I might have misspoke there. I mentioned Supreme Court of Canada or a court of, one of our courts of appeal, but I have no idea. Actually, I know for sure the Supreme Court of Canada, but whether any of the Court of Appeal of any of the provincial provinces can issue these kinds of or render decisions on reference cases. So that I don't know, and I don't want to give the impression that they can.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Just because
I was about to rely on that as legal advice.
like, yeah, we just don't do that. Like, so it's really weird to hear. Like, there's in my time, I've done research on gaming laws for apps, and to figure out,
Gaming meaning like gambling, correct?
yeah,
Yes.
and so like online gambling and apps, there are a lot of hoops for companies that make games that have a gambling component to it, for like, is it a game of chance or game of skill? And their states have advisory opinions from their attorney general on what's what. So but it's not like the state Supreme Court. Now, sure, there might be case law, but it's a really weird beast. So I'm just glad we stumbled into this very interesting discussion about advisory opinions from courts. So go on, Greg, because I think we have a little more left for.
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt any further unless you were actually had finished your thorough analysis of the Darksaber title.
No, I think I'm pretty much done there. I
Okay.
just want to maybe just as a point of interest, just follow the kind of like the path of the chain of title, or whatever you want to call it, of the Darksaber, since Rebels, and I'm just so freaking excited that with that new Ahsoka trailer came out, that we're going to get live action Sabine Wren. Freaking awesome, like,
And Hera.
Okay. And
And
Hera,
Jason.
yes, absolutely, yeah. And we've seen Zeb as well, right? Well, that's from Rebels, right? Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's the same one. Yeah. So Sabine Wren found the Darksaber on Dathomir. I think it was like Darth Maul's lair or something like that. And then she went in a duel against Gar Saxon to be the rightful possessor. So she won it in combat against him, even though when she originally found it, she did not win it in combat there. So there, under this unwritten constitution, if you can call it that she is the rightful owner. Then she gifted it to Bo-Katan. Right. And then we all know what happened to that. And then I guess we can surmise it was stolen by Moff Gideon from Bo-Katan.
Spoilers from the next episode. So that's explained in the next episode.
Okay.
So, I'm not going to tell you other than we get more facts in the next episode.
Sounds good. And then after that, it was won in a duel. We saw that in the last episode of season 2 of The Mandalorian by Din Djarin. We went through, he was dispossessed of it, the Darksaber in combat by that weird cyborg. Bo-Katan defeated the cyborg, and then she momentarily possessed Darksaber before returning it to Din Djarin. But then Din Djarin, of course, in this episode, he gave that speech about how no, Bo-Katan's the rightful owner because she won it in combat against that cyborg, even though it wasn't a duel per se, I guess you could say. So that's the chain of possession or title of that Darksaber.
Yeah, I have a problem with how do you define combat? Is stepping in a giant trap combat? Because when Paz Vizsla challenged Din Djarin in the Book of Boba Fett, like, that was set up as a duel. This was like, oh, look, a helmet, and he tries to pick it up, and the giant bear trap closes on him. That's not a fight.
Well, I do think it's interesting that, like, as Greg's really great collection of all of the sort of, references to this unwritten rule kind of lays out, I do think it is a bit of a mistake, perhaps, on our part to have interpreted it as a duel, based on the references to what seems to be, the law or the tradition. It may be a more generalized form of combat. It does seem important that it is real combat, as opposed to like something ceremonial, like, because otherwise, right, that would have been very easy for Bo-Katan and Jin. They could have had a duel, but a non-lethal duel, and then Jin yields. But in this case, I think it is important that there are mortal stakes, and I think that was technically true. So even though it wasn't a duel, and this creature defeated Din Djarin through a trap, essentially, he was going to kill Din. It was not non-mortal encounter. And similarly, Bo-Katan was in mortal combat with the creature in order to rescue him. So I find that interesting. I think this was actually a great example from the writers of sticking to those sort of rules and showing off that the Mandalorians have a serious respect for rules and procedure and not fudging it. But I think they may have chosen their words carefully for that reason. And I very much love that.
And this is a perfect issue for a reference case to the Supreme Court of Mandalore.
Yes,
once their
they
society
reform
is
it.
reestablished. And that would be right in your factum, Nari, or brief or whatever you submit for these kind of reference cases.
Oh man, that would be so much fun, Josh. We should think about that as instead of a mock trial, a mock oral argument before the newly formed Supreme Court of Mandalore.
It'd probably be a petition.
Yeah, but you could totally have argument, at least. So I don't know how it works in Canada. Sorry, Greg, but I do know that, for example, even if there is not a lawyer to argue one side of an issue, there is a procedure by which at least some circuit courts can appoint a lawyer to argue one side of a legal issue that they think hasn't been fully briefed. So they could literally appoint two lawyers, you and you guys argue opposite sides of this question for us to help us better understand it.
And there could also be interveners in these kinds of, for these, again, I'm just speaking way beyond, what I do. So I just don't know how the procedures work. I just remember reading reference cases. I don't know how the procedures whatsoever, but I imagine, like with a lot of things that go to at the Supreme Court level, that there could, especially a public interest of things like the real life things like the succession of Quebec, that you have interveners making submissions.
Yeah, I could see that being a specialized area of law, like the way some people do appeals, that's what they do. So again, fascinating. Again, the more you know. So with that, one final issue is, were Bo and Din deputized law enforcement officers or just private investigators? And which one of you added that bad boy?
I added it, but I did
away.
not do much research on this one at all because I forgot I added it. But I can speak a little bit to it, perhaps. It's kind of weird. It's like they are, one thing and an analog to a real life situation, but obviously this turned out way better than that. I'm not sure if you read of what's going on in Mali right now, and they basically kicked out the French for the security to help with their security and fighting jihadists, and they hired the Wagner Group. Yes, the same Wagner Group mercenaries who are hiring, recruiting from jails criminals to fight in Ukraine, right? And it went about as well as you think it has been gone. So it's just really weird. But here, of course, it did not go that way. The Mandalorians are thankfully not like the Wagner Group. So I guess one theory is that they could be deputized somehow as peace officers, as we call them here. Maybe they're temporary peace officers. They're allowed to use some kind of lethal force, but it is kind of strange that you're allowing strangers into essentially just without even escort with local police detachments, because they mentioned they think they have local constables, right? Not even
Yes, they do.
working with local constables to investigate, but yet they're going around armed and all sorts of stuff. So it's kind of strange, but it was just an open question. It's like, okay, well, what is their status? But it seems like it's something to that effect, that they were deputized or for a short-term period of time as some kind of peace officers.
Yeah, I see that. I could also see the private investigator, because there are droids that arrest Christopher Lloyd.
That's
and
right.
so the droids take him away after he's captured. That still raises the issue that he gets captured, which is making an arrest. So
yeah, this is a topic that the legal geeks have talked about before, and I didn't come fully prepared to discuss it, but I know that we've gotten into great detail on this with respect to the Mandalorian, is like the difference between a law enforcement and a private actor when it comes to, for example, bounty hunting or citizens arrests and all kinds of things that we have, at least in the United States, that sort of toe the dividing line. I think I hope you're right, Greg, that they were deputized, because as we've covered in those other analyses, if you are not deputized as law enforcement, you're taking on a lot of risk from a legal perspective, a lot of civil and criminal liability that can
Absolutely.
attach that a law enforcement officer would be shielded from, and could do essentially a lot more law enforcement activity, like making stops, arresting people under lower standards of burden. So, needing reasonable suspicion to make a short stop or things like that. You don't have that if you're a private citizen. And you could just be on the hook for false imprisonment if you try to detain someone even for a short time.
Yeah, it's a weird question. I have mixed feelings on it because of how it plays out, because it's
well, as it was
it's-
pointed out, the droids made the arrest, but they went through a very serious chase in which there was a lot of physical danger.
it's not as bad as Batman and the Gotham Police Department, but it's close, because at least with Batman, you have like a confidential informant that's subduing the evildoer, and then the police go in and arrest the villain. Arguably, that's the situation that's here, except you had the heads of state send in Mando and Bo to investigate and find out, because they don't have their own resources to do so. So it's
Yeah.
might be comparable to the superhero conundrum.
I was going to say that they detained a bar full of droids, except in Star Wars, I think they don't count as people.
Yeah, which is again problematic. So and all of Din's progress over being nice to droids kind of takes a backseat for a short period. But then again, it's like, you literally killed my parents. That model was the one that murdered my parents. That's a tough one to get over when you look at the B2 battle droids. like this, I could see him getting a little high strung. So I can accept that. Well, with that, Greg, where can people follow you on social media?
Well, I used to say Twitter, but with relatively recent events, I'm not quite on Twitter much anymore. So you just find me on LinkedIn, Gregory Pang, lawyer. You could just find me there, and that's about it at this point. Oh, and you can find my podcast, Legal Cut Pro. We're talking about entertainment law. Me and my associate, Michelle. So it's about Canadian entertainment law.
Excellent. And Nari, you have a very minimal social media presence. So anything you want to share?
You can find me on Legal Geeks podcasts and panels when we make appearances. But I did want to have a closing thought, which was I did really enjoy this episode. I also, I went on for quite a while about the free exercise thing, but I did want to say that I thought it was really neat the way that they depicted the society, which was a direct democracy, which kind of gets a bit of a bad rap, at least in the United States, for kind of being chaotic and disorderly. But that brief moment in this episode really showed that this society cared very much about the rule of law, and that process mattered, and that even though it was wildly inconvenient that they couldn't bring in their own hired security forces, that I'm sure they paid a pretty penny for, sitting right outside the city, couldn't send in their own security forces to deal with the problem, did not break that law, and instead found the technical loophole, which is, of course, the lawyer's best trait, to allow an armed security force to come in.
Exactly. So everyone, thanks for go on, Greg. Were you?
Sorry, I was just about to say one thing you just reminded me, Nari, is that now somewhere else you could find me is that I'll be on a panel at the Calgary Comic Expo at the end of this month, talking about the Mandalorian. So myself, a Crown prosecutor, and a crime author are going to be on that panel. So we don't know which day yet, but we'll be in Calgary to talk Mando and representing Legal Geeks up there in the north.
Yes, and please record it so we can share it to everyone. So
sounds good. Will do.
Excellent. So everyone, wherever you are, thank you. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and of course, stay geeky. Take care now.